Welcome, everybody. I want to tell you that Andrea Olson, our wonderful curator, director, choreographer, reason for this whole show, she asked me to tell you that she invited me to welcome you. So, welcome again to this history panel. I'd like to welcome the large community, particularly the people who are attending the seminar, and a very special welcome to, and I don't see too many of you, students from the Five College Dance Department, and I'll tell you why you're special in a few minutes. And welcome to this beautiful theater, which I would like to say in the early 70s, when these women were arriving, this theater had just opened. So it's really been a container for the results of their work over the years. My name is Susan Waltner, and I'm an emerita professor from Smith College and the Five College Dance Department. And I'm a bit of a relic because I was actually here before any of them were here. So we're going to hear some, I'm sure, some wonderful stories about what brought these women here at the time that they came. But we were reminded at the archives panel that when you're looking at something that happened, it's also important to know where it happened. So I'm just going to say a few things about the place and some things that happened in the place very quickly. My metaphor is a nest, and either a nest that gets built up by twigs or nests within nests. And luckily, this morning in Bonnie's workshop, we talked about eggs. So it's a perfect metaphor. So one of the twigs that built the nest, that received them, or one of the nests within the nest, was the academic dance department. And just a couple things about that. There was a lot going on in the very early 70s before they arrived, actually before Hampshire opened, or just as it opened. Lots of innovations in teaching and curriculum, involvement of students in planning their curriculums, their majors, new majors, etc. Hampshire just opened, and the women, mostly women, in the small dance programs at Smith, Hampshire, Mount Holyoke, and UMass, we're starting to talk to each other about the possibility of collaborating, talking with each other, and in that way making the presence of dance stronger on all of the campuses. So we were just beginning and bubbling these conversations, and they lasted all through the 70s. So there were some literal spaces, just a couple I'll mention, that were relevant to their being here. One was this theater. The Crew House at Smith College was here then. A lot of you have probably experienced some of their work in the Crew House. And the first Hampshire Dance Studio, which maybe some of you remember, which was on the top floor of the library. It's no longer there. And then later the other two studios at Hampshire. Lots of other spaces, but those two seemed, a lot of us have memories of working with these people in those two particular studios. So who were we that were bubbling around in the dance department? We were dancers, and we had come from very specific dance techniques. Graham, Limon, Vokeen, Cunningham, and Hawkins, particularly, because we all studied 8 technique. But we also, a lot of us had backgrounds in dance therapy, anatomy, and idiokinesis. So we were also looking at how do we enhance our dance teaching. Another just thing I want to mention is that we had a graduate program at Smith, and 2 of the early graduate students had been to Oberlin, and they had run into contact improvisation at Oberlin College. Both of them ended up teaching at Hampshire, which is sort of a wonderful thing. So as soon as Bonnie, Nancy, and Janet arrived, we found them. Or maybe we found each other. We went to their classes and workshops. We got enriched personally. Some of them were in the basements of their homes and people's living rooms, etc. Then we started inviting them some of them onto campus, and we helped sponsor workshops and classes and master classes. We sent our students to them, and gradually, over the years, their presence on the campuses increased. We studied with one of them, some of us studied with two of them, and some of us studied with all three of them. And so there was this, even within one person, as well as with the whole faculty, there began to be this blend of influences from their work that we were translating into our dance training and also into our creative work, choreography. It was a huge joy to be here when they were here. We were so excited. It was going along with our planning of the department. They were enriching our training of our students and working with them. It was a huge honor. We didn't even know at the time how wonderful it was, but all of us in retrospect certainly were aware of that. So we like to claim, the dance department, the Five College Dance Department, likes to claim a few twigs, or at least one of the nests within the nests. That was the container here then for their work. So outside the dance department, just really quickly, there was farmland between Northampton and Amherst. There was no malls, there were no Trader Joe's, there were only a couple restaurants, etc. There was a department store in Northampton called McCallum's, which had another iteration before it became Thorne's. There was a Woolworth's, there was a Peck and Peck, and there were a lot of hippies. One of the other handfuls of twigs, or one of the other nests within the nest, was in downtown Northampton. And I'm going to introduce you to Annie Woodhull. She is a poet who works with children. She's also one of the 4 innovators who created Thorne's Market in the late 70s through the 90s. Those creative spaces on the 3rd floor also held the work of all of the speakers today as they grew and developed. And she's going to share with us a poem about the importance of empty space for the imagination in the heart of community.
Yay. Thank you, Susan. Nice to have that history line. Yeah. So Andrea Olson asked me to read a poem about space, and I didn't think I had one. And it's a bit of a story for me to tell you how I got to realize I did have one. But I was lucky enough to work with Janet and Bonnie on the 3rd floor of Thorne's, and lucky enough to witness and admire Nancy and her people doing their radical dancing. So I feel like I have a sense of them in a personal way, which is incredible. I was thinking about how they all brought a lot of what they knew to this valley, which was an incredible boost for everybody, as Susan described. But they also brought what they didn't know. And especially yesterday when I saw the films of all of them, I was reminded of it, and Jan referred to it too, the importance of not knowing. And I feel that all 3 of them has a kind of courage and ferocity and heart, so that they always pushed inside of and made use of the unknown. And they're still doing that. And then I realized I did have a poem about not knowing. My husband and I never knew what we were doing. We were falling, tripping, making mistakes, sometimes arriving. And that's what was going on in the APE space. And then in that land that Susan described, all of a sudden an accident happened and someone put before us the idea of buying a piece of farmland. And my husband, who always had visions, decided that would be a great idea to buy this farmland that was later called Bramble Hill Farm, and that it would be another kind of protected space. But what I forgot to say, what I wanted to say earlier, is that not knowing is also a kind of space. and that it's bigger than we all are. And it's always the place where we find creativity and the next idea. So this is my poem, finally, called Open Field, and I wrote it in 1998, and after we started a foundation to buy this piece of land, and the thing about a foundation is we personally wouldn't own the land. We would now be stewards of the land, and that felt just right. So here's the poem I wrote for my husband that day in 1998. Open Field. We lie on top of the hill we have and will never own. The sun of spring on our front, the cold of winter still in our back. All we can do is imagine. All we know is that 15 kinds of grass will replace our imprints. What will graze, walk, grow, learn here? These things we get to not know together. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Laurie Sanders, one of the co-directors from Historic Northampton, and this with me is Betty Sharp, other co-director.
Welcome.
I'd like to acknowledge our partners before we begin and give another piece of context for today's Living History series. First, I want to recognize our partners, APE, the School for Contemporary Dance and Thought, Smith College's Department of Dance. I want to make a special call out to Andrea Olson for inviting us and helping to coordinate all of today and this week's such an important role this last week. And I also want to acknowledge a sponsor for Historic Northampton, for our Living History series. They are our major sponsor. Smith College is our major sponsor for the 2019-2020 academic year. So a big thank you to all of our partners and sponsors. At Historic Northampton, Betty and I began there 3 years ago, and in 2017, we recognized that there are many extraordinary people living in our midst. And one of the things that brings history alive is that contemporary component and relevance. And so we started this series called the Living History series to honor and recognize those people in Northampton who have been affected by Northampton and have also affected Northampton and the broader world. And we have 3 extraordinary women with us today who have done just that. In terms of a slightly broader context for dance, Susan did a fabulous job looking at from the 1970s to the present, but dance has had a very long and important history here in Northampton. In fact, the first dance hall is very much in some ways a mirror of what Thorns became. It was called the Tontine Building. It was built on the corner of Bridge Street and Hawley Street in 1786. And on the 3rd floor was a dance hall. If you look at the records for businesses in Northampton during the 19th century, you see evidence of people who are advertising because they give dance lessons. By the 1890s, the Academy of Music is in place, and there has already been a long history of dance performers, troupes coming to perform not only in Northampton, but also later, but after 1892, at the Academy of Music. Smith College, which begins in 1875, immediately the students start having dances. And they're very much in that early tradition. There are waltzes, and they dance at College Hall. And over time, of course, things change. So I wanted to describe something that happened here at Smith College as Smith College's dance appreciation changes. And this is from an article that was printed on Smithopedia. based on the Smith College archives. After the First World War, American society in general experienced many social changes, and Smith was no exception. During the 1920s, jazz and the new styles of dancing that came along with it arrived, to some amount of consternation. An article in the New York Sun, published in 1928, talks about the arrival of the Charleston at Smith College. Quote, on the ground floors of 40 dormitories, strictly on the ground floors, the young women of Smith College gaily danced the Charleston. As a result of it, plaster cracked and walls weakened. Chunks of ceilings fell down to astonished carpets, and the matrons who are in charge of the dormitories blanched at the thought that soon they would be in charge of nothing in particular. We are shaken, the house mother said. Everything is shaken. A bottle of cream left untended immediately becomes butter. What shall we do? It's good exercise, suggested the president. Not for houses, countered the mothers. And so the president of Smith College issued his pronouncement. Hereafter at Smith College, there shall be no dancing of the Charleston above the first floors. The other floors can't stand the shock.
Well, we've gone from nest to shock and back again. My questions are about Northampton and being here in Northampton and what it meant to you. So the first question I have for you is why Northampton? How did you happen to arrive here? We'll just go this way. Bonnie, you want to start?
Can you hear me or do I have to come closer?
Move a little closer. Mm-hmm.
I have to calibrate the space. I could do this too.
Yeah.
There you go. What was I going to say? 19. In 1976, my husband and our 2 children, expecting a third, were leaving New York City, and we didn't know where to go exactly. And we had a friend who had a house on Cape Cod in Truro, and they had just winterized it, and he said we could rent it. In those days, it was $100 a month, so you can cry. So we went there, and we were going to live there, and I realized it was too isolated. We were going back to New York for me to teach, because that's how he was getting ready to set up a chiropractic office. And I said that just before he signed the contract, it's too isolated for me here. So in the fall, we went to New York, and on our way back, we came through Massachusetts. We are in Massachusetts, yes. And because he was licensed here, he'd passed the test. And we started in the Berkshires, and that felt too isolated. And he said, there's a town called Amherst. And I knew Susan Waltner from Eric's, and the woman who was at UMass then, whose name I'm blocking on. Anyway, we came into town. We came through Northampton first. So for me, it's the Valley, as well as Northampton was a little bit later for teaching. And we just drove into Amherst. I had said we had stopped in Northampton, met somebody. And we said, this feels like home. Mm. And he got out of the car and went to see how many chiropractors were in Amherst. And there weren't any. And so we just felt like home, and it still does. And then through the years, we used Smith and Mount Holyoke and Hampshire and different areas to teach in our programs. Oh, I forgot. Brinkley Thorne offered us the space. Was it Lithuanian?
Pleasant Street.
The Lithuanian Club, and that was our first place to teach. And then he also was taking class, and then he said that you were going to somehow, there was some switch in going to this that store was closed for a while, I don't remember. McCallum's. And it became Thorne's, and then we moved to the third floor there. And then, meanwhile, Andrea had invited me to come to Mount Holyoke, where you were, and there was UMass, and it began to mix up.
And what year was that you came again?
Well, we first came through in '96, but we moved here in January of '77.
77. Great.
And Tara McClellan was at Hampshire, and she said, I heard you were coming. And we were the basement where Susan, right away, we became friends and colleagues.
Janet?
I was working with Mary. Can you hear me? Is this good?
Yeah, move a little closer. Sit a little closer. There you go.
I was working with Mary Whitehouse in 1969, maybe 68. I can't remember, but I had closed my life in Pittsburgh, having just finished Looking for Me, the film that we shared yesterday, and was sent really to Mary Whitehouse. That's another story, but I got to Mary Whitehouse, and she had just learned about her illness, her health, and she was talking one day about, in the midst of me totally pouring myself out in her presence through what we were calling authentic movement. And in the midst of all that, she said, by the way, John Bodiger, a man who, one of 3 professors at Amherst, is starting a new college called Hampshire College. And he would like me to come and teach authentic movement there. And instead of having a traditional dance department, he thought it would be interesting to have an authentic movement department.
Of course.
Where was she? Where were you with Mary?
In LA.
In LA.
Yeah, Santa Monica. Yeah, yeah. And so she said, obviously I can't do that, even though, and this is so amazing, I just thought of this last night, even though John had invited her to come maybe 6 months before and to give a workshop in the crew house for the 5 college people who were interested in dance. And somehow she and I were on the phone at that time, and she'd asked me to come with her, but we hadn't met. And I felt quite touched by that, but I wasn't ready to just jump at that time. I forget what I needed to be attending to. So she taught a workshop at Hampshire College, and at the crew house, and it might be that some of you were there.
Where was that?
1970, no, that must have been 96 or 7. I'm very bad with the dates. Late 60s. And so that had already happened. So I can't believe it. Mary was in the crew house. Oh, and then, while I'm in the midst, as I was saying, of all my entire life pouring out in her presence, she said, by the way, John is coming, and he would like me to come and take this job, and I can't, and I've told him that I would like you to take that job for me. So in the midst of all that, I did return to the East Coast and began to teach authentic movement at Hampshire College, upstairs.
In the library?
in the library. I see it
It's a new
vividly.
building, the plaster was in good shape.
That's right, the plaster was in very good shape.
And you stayed on from then on in the area until you
Yes,
left?
that was, yes, I was there here for 15 years. Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And you married him too, didn't you?
Yeah.
I remember when your name was Janet Bonnier. I thought, oh, wow.
By the way. It had something to do with my work with Mary being cut a little short. Yeah. The need to come to the east, yeah.
So my entry to Northampton was that we made, I was working with Steve Paxton and others with Contact. And I was on the West Coast in California for a couple of years after being at Oberlin as a student. And then I would come east in the fall to tour with Steve and others on the East Coast. And we made the Vermont Contact Conference in the summer of 1977 in Putney, near Putney, there's Becky, at the Wyndham School then, right? And there were a number of people involved. And Danny Lepkoff, who was somebody who I'd been doing contact with, he lived in New York, and he had met Beth Gorin. And they were exchanging, and she was dancing with him, and he was taking, I guess, classes with her in your work. So we invited her to teach at the Vermont Contact Conference. And we were pretty amazed at what we were experiencing in her class. And Lisa and I and others. So because I was going to be on the East Coast that fall of '77 for this touring with Steve and others, I needed a place to base myself. And we said, oh, Bonnie's coming up, and she's going to be starting her school. And so we based here so that we could take your class. And meanwhile, I ended up teaching in your school on that street. And Brink, I believe, also took my contact class at Bonnie's in that building in '77. And then Lisa ended up with, because I went back and forth to California and back here in the falls, because we also, the magazine had already started. And we found a guy in Haydenville, Steve Strymer, who many of you might know, who's involved with collectives and all that. And he had who's also an astrologer, and he had a press called Aldebaran Press, which is based on the Aldebaran Star, I guess, and had a typesetting machine in his barn behind their house. And it was exactly the one that I had learned to typeset on in Point Reyes with Diane DePrima. So we started making the magazine there. So it became a reason to also come back here. I know, isn't that amazing?
I just saw him yesterday.
Yeah. So we went back and forth, and Lisa got a loft on Pleasant Street over Downtown Sounds, and that was, I think, where we made the issue with you the first time, et cetera.
So it sounds like when you got here, you found some kindred spirits. I'm wondering if when you got here, you also found some negative energy? Did you find that there were people who either within the academy or outside of your dance circles who didn't think that what you were trying to do was a worthwhile endeavor, and especially for younger women at this time?
No.
No, I would agree. I feel like there's a game show or something. No, but I was just realizing from what you said that it's like a beacon or something, like a plant that grows towards the light. Mm-hmm. And I ended up in the room with you and Pat Barty and doing these things, and then Gordy and Brink and the building, and it's just like you go on the pathways that are illuminated for you. Mm-hmm. I didn't feel any negativity, but there was a lot of empty spaces.
Yeah.
So there was a sense of kind of ghost townishness a little bit, which really I noticed how it changed over the years. All second floors were sort of boarded up generally at that time downtown.
Yeah.
But I want to say something about the opposite. When I did come to Hampshire for my interview, it had been arranged that people from the 5 colleges who were interested would come and see the film Looking for Me, which was a lovely invitation, and we did that. And then afterwards, there was this woman sitting in the audience with white hair pulled up tight, this beatific face, all in black, of course, you know. And she went like this. And then she went like this, and she scooted over, and non-verbally, she was telling me to sit right next to her, which I did, and she leaned to me and said, "Come to breakfast on Sunday at 10. I will make bacon." And that was Rosalind DeMille, whose welcome and whose presence in all those years that we lived here and all the years after was enormously central in my own growing and companionship. She was a deep companion. Her wisdom, our friendship, I have to name her as the light on the other side of any shadows that might have been lurking, which I wasn't aware of either.
I'm wondering about the idea of the nest, in that you found a nest here. And I'm wondering what other things in town might have contributed to that nest, besides your immediate, associations with each other and other dances and the dance departments. So I'm wondering about the people who took your classes, the clients, and who they were. I know that some of you work with disabled children or with people with mental illness, and I'm wondering how those associations in Northampton may have started for you.
I had been working, yes, it was at this time, at Austin Riggs, the beautiful mental health facility, especially for young adults. And I also felt very welcomed there by Joan Erickson. She and Eric Erickson had started this beautiful, beautiful space. Joan had arrived and fired all the occupational therapists and hired all artists. So I had the privilege of being the dancer person or the dance therapist. And that was a very special place for me that was part of this time. I remember traveling back and forth. And I also remember the hospital, I guess it was for veterans, that huge big building along the highway. I remember also feeling privileged to be welcomed there, to work with these, at that time, all men.
Was this the VA in Northampton?
So as I began to find other ways of work, those two experiences come to mind. Again, in terms of a sense of interest and welcome. The psychiatrist, as always, I was used to this as a dance therapist, were a little bit, at the VA hospital, I noticed all the psychiatrists went into their offices and closed the doors when it was time for dance therapy. So there was a little, I was wondering who these people were and how we might learn some stuff together, but that didn't happen there. It did happen with the Ericksons.
Did you ever go to Northampton State Hospital, which was for the mentally ill, which
Yes.
was on West Street?
Yeah, I did not. I don't know, did you?
Did you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just wondered. I mean, it was still, in existence then. I think it finally closed its doors in 1993, but it was still partially opened, and I wondered if they had been open to this kind of thing, or if you had penetrated that.
As I was pondering your question and nothing was coming to mind, what did come to mind was the spaces, actually, as invitations, whether it was ultimately Thorns or that place on Pleasant Street or this barn where, behind Strymer's house, and just the atmosphere was very inviting to do stuff. And I felt immediately plunged. Maybe a lot of your students came up from New York, I think, a number of them for the classes in '77. So there was never a sense of needing to try to attract people. It was like who was there, and they told other people, and it just sort of had a natural way of growing. And I think it did bring a lot of people to the area. I know it did, that might not have been here before. But whether it was Whalen's Office Supply or other places, and I think on Main Street, where I think the Owl is or something, that last building, there was a grocery store.
Yep.
So that downtown was sort of a place where people lived, and there was a grocery store and a hardware store and a, office supply, my favorite. And so there were places, and there were a lot of empty places to move in, which is a dancer's delight. It's like, all right, let's go there. So you didn't have to fight for space or try to find space, which was extremely inviting, and people to work with who were open-minded in different ways, and it was ideal. Yeah.
So did you all bring students with you, or I know during the 1960s UMass grew by leaps and bounds, and so there was many more young people in the area as UMass graduates moved here also. But how did the word spread that you were here, or your beginning relationships with one another?
I had started what is Body Mind Centering in 1973 in our apartment in New York. And is Linda here? She was in a class of 3 people in 1973, and we're still together. And when we left New York in the fall of '76 and moved to the Cape and then came here in January, 3 or 4 people moved here right away. Linda came later. Pat Barty came, and Beth did not come then. 2 people whose names I'm just going to say they came. Joy Graham, Susan Peffley, they did come. If I don't try, they'll come, but if I try, then everything shuts down. And then the first class that I offered was in our basement, and Susan was there, and Tara McClellan from Hampshire, and a woman from Greenfield, I'm blocking on her name, later, she was dance movement therapist at Keene. And then people came up from New York City. And then the first summer was 1977. I had just given birth to my youngest and your youngest, and so we became friends of babies. People came up from New York in that summer program, and it was in the old gymnastics school before the gymnastics school was built in Amherst. Is it Hampshire Gymnastics? Yeah. Is that what it's called? Yeah. And it was in an old storage place, no windows, just a big dark space. And that was the first summer of the endocrine glands, and it was amazing. And
Endocrine glands.
Then,
that's what she said.
And then every summer we would have a program, and it grew, and people came eventually in '86, we had 100 international students, not all international. It was a 4-year program, and then we were in different spaces. I'm thinking I was teaching a weekly dance class somewhere here. There was a little space on the top floor of Fitzwillies, which I did a sound singing or sounding with Randall McClellan, who was at that time chair of the music department at Hampshire College, had wonderful acoustics in this little room up on the top of Fitzwillies. There was another space in Fitzwillies, as well as the Northeast Ballet with Tony. There was a space on Holly, that first building, I think, when there used to be something on the corner that got some eating
Jack August
place.
or something that got burned down?
Yeah, but there was a space in that next building. Anyway, it was the space, and it wasn't so expensive that you could rent it. And there was a sense of caretaking and of real welcome first of all, it's the air here. I don't just mean the ozone but there's a very special, very, very special, this valley. And so I was in Amherst living, but it was the area, weaving in the 5 colleges, and I see Susan there was so supportive, and somebody else's home, and I'm seeing Annie, and then the babies. I saw your babies, and people brought their babies, and some people came actually from Europe to bring their babies or their children, and other states, and then some families. I saw a baby, and actually she wasn't a baby, she was 5. And the next thing I heard was the following week they came and bought land in Hadley and built a house and moved here. And there was, as Carrie, I don't know if Carrie's in the audience, she was in the class this morning. She brought her child from New Jersey, and the next thing they moved here. And today I danced with the little boy that brought them here. He was in class today. And 2 families have asked if they could bring their child in this weekend. Some of you saw a little boy, he's 37, the little boy who's now 37. Anyway, it's just something so special here. It is so, so special. And all the summers at the Crew House. And once we were to do a advanced teacher training. I'm seeing people who were there. I'm seeing Gail, who moved here, I don't know what year, and became one of our major teachers. We were doing something in East Street, and at that point they had some kind of print shop or something, and the odor was so bad, I didn't know what to do. It was, again, an international group, and Susan opened up Smith. At that point, we could finish here. It was just this sense of camaraderie and helping each other, and people were going back and forth. Everybody was studying everything else. It was a mix, and it wasn't like, oh, I don't know, it's just incredible, and it still is. It's just, I mean, look, it just still is. And there are people who came here from New York for this, and other places, Vermont.
I think there was.
Please.
Okay. I'm just realizing that one of the effects of making a publication, which I sometimes made in California and sometimes here, and after we did the interviews with Bonnie and people who might come to the magazine as contact improvisers, but then they would find an article about Bonnie, and they go, what's that? And they wouldn't do contact anymore, and they would do BMC for the rest of their lives. Or somebody like Susan Schell, who I met in Ann Arbor doing contact and action theater, and then she comes here to study with you, and so the works were interweaving through the people who were finding them and finding each other and moving to different places. So I feel like the magazine, almost as a person, had a role in that. And people talk about community a lot, and I always think it's a result of, rather than the point of, a lot of these works. You're interested in something.
I love you saying that.
I believe it, because I think one of the things with contact improvisation, that image that I've often enjoyed, and Ruth Sapora in Action Theater also talked about improvising being like building something together. So there's this third thing, and we're building a house together, therefore we have a relationship to one another. In contact improvisation, it's the same thing. You're making an improvisation, you're communicating. There's this third mind, you could say, at work that is a function of the two. But if you cut that off and you're just facing each other, it's like, who are you? Like, why am I talking to you? I mean, then it becomes about just the social, personal, perhaps, relationship. So it feels like the work has allowed us to meet one another, meet ourselves too, and in the process meet a lot of other people who have like-mindedness, and then you feel that resonance with other bodies of work. So almost instantly, improvisation newsletter was more than contact improvisation, because you touch other things, and then someone who does contact says, oh, there's this other great thing that I want to share with you. Okay, bring it on. And all of this starts to generate cross currents between everything, geographically and otherwise. So I think it was a force.
I think that your mission statement about the movement of ideas is key.
Yeah.
I don't remember the whole thing.
Vehicle for moving ideas. Yeah.
As I'm listening to you speak about this plane, these people, and then this, and then that, and this wonderful sense of a spacious, it feels very tangible. And I'm realizing at the very same time I was descending. And I even say that with some emotion. I at that very time, for reasons that I still don't understand, but you know, that gorgeous cross where the vertical is so much about what you're talking about, the mystery of the collective, and then, the horizontal, and then the vertical is the traveling within each of us, top to bottom, or earth up through, and we all have our experiences of that inner journey. And for some reason, arriving here, our children arriving at that time, and my full engagement with being a mother, which is also so intimate, and then just kind of a demand, a command that I attend to my inner life in this process of some kind of initiatory experience. So that's what was happening to me. And somehow in that time, I don't remember how it happened, but I do know we had some invitation or something to come to the Mary Starks White House Institute. And I remember Roz's drawings on the front of the invitation, Roz Driscoll drawing for about a year in the crew house, my moving, not knowing, of course, what was coming, and she recording that somehow, not knowing. And then the White House Institute started. These people came, and I'm loving what you were saying, Annie, again, about not knowing when you welcomed all of us. So much of my arrival at the Mary Starks White House Institute was not knowing, because of so much beginning to rise within me. And again, the privilege and the blessing that these people would actually come toward this and share in this inquiry with me. So much for me at that time was, who is the witness? I'd had a full turn as a mover with Mary and John, actually, Weir, but who is the witness? I had no idea, because that was Mary's job. So I really invited these people to come and say, you be the witness. That means just sit over there and keep your eyes open, and you move, and then what happens to you with you over there sitting with your eyes open. So that's how that exploration started. It felt so intimate. And then the second year, and in the midst, and I was continuing to be more and more challenged with inner experience, and this small group of people, really, I felt, many of you are here, I see you, your devotion to this way of work, and we were a little collective becoming, for the very reasons that you say so beautifully, because we were sharing such, to us, profound questions. Yeah.
So Janet, you talked about inquiry. Because Bonnie and Nancy talk about when you came, where were you at in terms of your inquiry of what you wanted to, what you felt was the unknown and that you wanted to explore?
I feel like I was very young. I was very young. And I was just very avid. I was into what I was into. I was curious. I wanted to do it all more. I was interested in what else was going on. And I loved it also that this making a magazine was a way that I could be in touch with other people that were not doing what I was doing, so that I could learn. I mean, I feel like I learned so much from all the interviews with Bonnie and working with you on the article, and this was my way to do both at once, to provide a service and also learn for myself. But that was like just a segment with the dancing itself. There were already a lot of people who were coming into this work, and so it was not based in Northampton. In fact, it was ultimately international, but it was a small network of people over a larger space, which is why I started the newsletters. Just write to this one P.O. box, and we'll all share it, so that we could stay in touch with what we were doing. That it was really had a function like that, and hopefully it continued and continues to have that function of sharing information amongst us. But and I think this will come up in the next panel about the role of not knowing or something. And I wasn't aware of not knowing. There was a lot I didn't know, that's for sure. But I think curiosity is related to that. It's like, what's that? Instead of, I don't like that. It's not what I do. You're bad. I'm good. You know, it's an attitude. I think it was more of an attitude, and it led me into having a greater and greater interest in what that kind of space could elicit. And then how do you cultivate that instead of just come upon it or be curious? So that shifts the activity a little bit. But I just felt really engaged and lucky to have other people around who were interested in the things that I was interested in. And the first tour that we did of contact improvisation to California was called You Come, We'll Show You What We Do. And that was sort of the attitude. It wasn't like, we've got something special to show you, please pay a lot of money and sit there. It was like, it was an atmosphere of sharing. And I feel like all of these works were that, and the times were that too, which is a whole other interesting thing, is how does that spirit, is it contained in the form somehow? And can it travel over time as well as space? And does that, like a seed, kind of come out in people when they practice these different kinds of work in China, and in 2019 with all this stuff going on in the world? Like it's a changed environment, but has the work changed, and how does it work to transmit? And there are a lot of big questions, but I felt it was all very lively and available here then, that my curiosity could have fertile ground.
Can I just echo your word of cultivate, because I think it's a beautiful word, and I imagine that's one that we share very much, entering any emptiness in relationship to what might arise. What is necessary then is, do we choose to cultivate it? If we do choose to, how? And so comes then this magnificent, these planes feel equally interdependent, and so the cultivation is what kind of opens. Yeah. I love that word. Yeah.
I could just sit here and absorb. That's more of my strength, actually. Somewhere along the line, I've danced all my life, and I also studied anatomy from 16 years old, seriously, and somehow they came together. And also, there was a time, I am also an occupational therapist, and when I was interning in a rehab center, and a man had had a stroke, and his arm was flaccid or flail, and I took his arm out of the sling, and I felt I could be holding a piece of meat. I didn't have any idea what I was holding. It was just a weighted something. And I was so appalled that, quote, I was supposed to help this man in some way, although I was told by my supervisor, don't take his arm out of the sling because it will give him false hope. I kept taking his arm out of the sling and wondering what I was holding. And I kind of made a vow. I make these vows to myself. One day I would know what was in my hands, and we did a little bit of that today. And then another key, that was in Ohio in 1964. No, 1963. And then in 66, in January or February, I started to study in New York with Andre Bernard. And some of you will know who Andre Bernard is. And also later with Barbara Clark, who was Andre's teacher, and Barbara was a student of Mabel Ellsworth Todd and the thinking body of that tradition. And the first lesson I had with him was a very, very cold studio, acting studio in New York. Maybe Anthony Menino, anyone who's old enough to remember. And he had a human pelvis, and he had me hold it. Just hold it, feel the balance of it, and feel the sits bones. And I did with my egg. And then he said, now feel your own. And I had been studying anatomy. I began in 1958 with, anyway, I don't have to go on. And so from 58 to 66, I had studied intensively. I knew a lot about anatomy. I'd done cadaver work and cats and animals. I had never experienced my own anatomy. I was a dancer, but I never felt my sits bones from the inside. I could move them. And so that set me on a journey. So I have had many, many, many decades now of exploring that question. So I was doing that in New York. I began there with bones and muscles, and there's so many stories. Anyway, I hadn't gone through all the systems. I did the first workshop on the organs in 1976, living on Cape Cod, going to New York for 2 weekends, over 2 weekends, was the first public workshop on the organs. And then we moved here, and then it was the glands in the summer. And so over the time here, I was eventually, how do you feel the difference between your blood and how do you find your blood? How do you find your cerebral spine? Where is the lymph? How do you do that? It's one thing if it's got, like, you can touch it, but when it's everywhere, how do you find it? And so that happened here in the valley. And the fluids were actually, it was either at Thorns, no, I think it was at Fitzwillies. There was another space there, not Tony's, but there was another open space. There were a lot of spaces, you had choices. Anyway, and then once I went through the body systems, then I went to subcellular. Well, if we could feel the bones, what are the bones, the cytoskeleton of a cell? And then became embryology about 22 years ago. I started actually the first embryology workshop. Was Beth Gorin, did she come? She was also in that first group a few months after Linda. I think it was in Thorns.
But if I could interrupt, what was your question about?
I was answering any old thing.
This is part of our relationship, actually, with the magazine.
This is what she does.
Yeah.
What do you
I
mean
try
by
not
that?
to interrupt too much, but, you know, it's like, well, but just, your question was about our inquiry, but also something about our inquiry here. Like, did it matter that we were, because it seems like your trajectory in your inquiry, it was in New York, was in Cape Cod, was in Fitzwilliams, was in Thorns, was in, you know, I mean, you were on a thing. And so I wonder about if your question was, did this environment have an effect on what our inquiry was, or how it went?
Yeah, I think that was my question. I guess I was most interested in like who you were when you came. You know, what you wanted to explore, what you were exploring in your own work. And then I guess a question is, did Northampton or the proximity to each other affect that? But I think as you're answering the question, what I'm hearing is it's not just here. It's your relationships, especially through the magazine, to everybody else, to back and forth to New York, to the West Coast, and that there's an energy around the country in this, and you're situated here, and you're doing both.
And
It
in
seemed that way
fact,
to me.
I think that the harmonic of the fact that we were all working made it seem like Northampton was a place to come. And people would arrive, and there really wasn't anything to come to. I mean, in a way. There wasn't like a school or a place or, you know, Thorn started to be a nexus, a hub. But people had to figure it out on their own, how they were going to make a life here, do their own work, share in different works, different overlapping communities, build them, relate with them. So it wasn't as clear as going to a particular school or something, but there was an atmosphere of engagement here that I think was actually quite accurate, but it was insubstantial until you got here and invested in it yourself.
Did you all know one another during that period and work?
I think you two did. I
Well,
was
it sounds like you two
well,
did too.
the babies.
We knew each other as young mothers.
Mothers.
Huh.
Yeah.
In Amherst. Is that where you were?
No,
Up
because you were
Northampton.
in Henshaw,
Henshaw, yeah.
and I was in
Yeah.
Amherst.
I felt your presence once removed, I think, because Susan was living at the house when she was doing your program, and I was aware of that. And I did actually come to your house once in Williamsburg when you were, when you were in that process. And so I felt very delicate with it because I didn't know how you were and how to proceed. But I felt you and also Edith, who was around, is very much a presence in this town, in the work.
Edith Sewald,
Yeah.
who was a very dear and old friend of Mary Whitehouse, who had come to help me with the White House Institute.
And she stayed on through the rest of her life. So
Okay.
that was also a kind of great attractor. There's a lot of great attractors.
You know, it's interesting to hear because you were working in places in LA and Santa Monica and New York, and so I think often for people who are like me on the outside, it can seem like, well, Northampton is small. But the other thing that the three of you have said is the space here. You know, so it's sort of this interesting dynamic that a small community that may not have what for someone like me would think of as the prestige of New York or in LA, actually was this great incubator. But I don't know if I'm.
Go ahead.
Oh, no.
You start this.
Did it feel small? I guess, did it feel like, oh, we're in Northampton? Did you ever?
No.
It's Northampton, folks. Come, this is Northampton.
But when
It's
you say this about the outer space, this community, this town, these beautiful places where we could study and practice, I immediately know, and I didn't know this until this moment when you spoke, Laurie, is that this is where I discovered the phenomena of the inner witness in this amazing place with all that we're talking about. Because the mover begins with her eyes closed in the presence of an outer witness, and it's the compassionate presence, enough compassionate presence of the outer witness that actually invites, it's an invitation to just the beginning seeds of an inner witness in the mover. So at first the witness sees the mover move, but as the process develops, the mover, because of this blessing, learns to see herself or himself. And then the most exciting thing is, once we can see ourselves more clearly and with more compassion and with less of that judgment and harshness that we tend to learn somehow in so many families and schools, that we can actually bring that compassionate presence to another. And that's, so somehow in Northampton, those two words, I think at that time I was naming it the internal witness, and that makes me interested in the conversation we had about language changing. As we discovered something, we would find a word, and then that word would change. Anyway, the inner witness feels closest to me to what can become our compass, our loving, compassionate inner compass that really more and more perhaps becomes intuitively based, and from that place lives more fully and imbues every relationship. The inner witness, the beauty of that phenomenon, imbues every relationship with, for me, that which is invisible, sacred. So that's what happened in Northampton. I just realized that the inner witness appeared so clearly only because of each one of you who came and trusted me to close your eyes in my presence. And we didn't know what would happen, did we? Yeah.
So this is reminding me of a place that makes a place where something can happen.
Yes.
And it seems like this town, these rooms, these people, these environments felt safe enough, felt interested enough that we could do our work, and these other places inside ourselves or between us could arise and therefore also become attractors for other people. So I think that Northampton, it's a paradox in a way, because the size of it felt significant, the proportions for me. It's not New York. I didn't want to live in New York. Totally did not want to live in fact, this was just outside of what I experience as the magnetic field of New York City. And that was a good thing. It was close enough you could get there, if you wanted to in a few hours, and that was a positive for me. Somehow I didn't go to Boston that much as a metropolitan center, but it felt like the vibrancy of the schools. There were intelligent people here. There were interesting movie theaters. There were like that. So I think that atmosphere really had a role. And I also felt an easy flow between the academic community and the artistic community. It wasn't like, what is it, cap and, anyway, whatever. Yeah. But aren't caps and gowns both academic?
Town gown.
Town gown, okay, yeah, okay. Cap and gown is a different thing. Yeah. It's about business or something. But yeah, so all those things, I think that did make this a pretty ripe area for these kinds of work to grow, for us to feel engaged here, to grow here, to a point of either moving somewhere else or, yeah.
Did you ever feel, based on who you are, I think I might know the answer, but did you ever feel that you had a practice, or you had a special way of being, and more people were coming in? Did you ever feel a sense of threat that your way could be diluted or or maybe individually confused as to, oh, is that way the better way, or anything that kind of, yeah, sort of the business part. No.
Competition, you
Yeah,
mean?
competition, or like how do you sustain that? I think it's fascinating. I mean, maybe it all comes maybe from who you are. This sort of willingness, openness, this collaborativeness. It's
We
how
really
do you encourage
supported
that? How
each
do you?
other.
Yeah.
We were weaving something together. So there were distinctions, but they helped to weave more our own at the same time. Like you would bug me a lot. What do you mean? Is this what you
Oh,
mean,
yeah, I
or
would
that's
stop
what
her.
you mean?
What do you mean by embody? And then she'd say, let me take your arm, and then I'd say, oh, you mean this? No. And then she'd do something else with my arm, and I'm trying to translate what she's putting into my arm into an idea of a language, and then she's hearing it and going, no, how about this? And I go, oh, and actually it ended up being the prepositions. You got it, the prepositions, man. Is it from that? Is it with that? Is it of that? Is it to that? And that would be where the transmission would happen. And when it hit it, you'd go, yeah.
It would happen. It would happen, and you all read it, and then you wrote. And it's hard to explain the incredibleness of our relationships and how the people who studied with us went out and did other things, and you all are doing other things and the same things in different ways. There is so much openness. There is so much openness. There is so much openness. What do you mean by that? I mean, there is so much openness.
I would like to hear that. What do you mean by that?
Actually,
Go.
no, your turn.
What was I going to say? I just pushed it right out of me. No. It's a phenomena, too, and I don't think it's just a kind of altruism or utopian thing. It's an actual experience of sort of the more you give, the more you get kind of thing. And listening promotes having a moment to speak. It's not all about one person doing something. It just doesn't work that way. So that, I mean, with contact improvisation too, if there are more people doing it, they are touching more people who become interested, and then more people are interested for your classes. So it's not like, oh, if you teach, you're going to take people away from me. No, you're going to make more people interested in the thing that I love. How could that be bad? And I think that that's true in all of these bodies of work, which is actually remarkable in this world. Not to say that there haven't been frictions if there's a small community and there's one person who's the main person who's doing something and then someone else starts teaching. It's like, a little bit odd, but people ultimately work it out. They find their way to be mutually supportive. I'll teach a slightly different aspect of it, or, they find a way to collaborate, and that has been proven to be very positive for all of us, and therefore I think it keeps that atmosphere going.
And I'm also thinking of your question about how we can, as colleagues, become competitive or co-workers or something. I remember when I began as a dance movement therapist, that we didn't even have that title. The word somatic didn't exist. There was nothing. And so when I began to know about you and then meet you and then we shared so many students here. I felt so supported. I felt the opposite. I felt like, oh, finally, I am not wandering around with this word embodiment and this devotion to this phenomena and so on alone. So, and now it's incredible to me in the world, actually, how many choices people have in their discerning how they want to study their own experience of embodiment. How many choices now, and each one, so many offered with so much integrity, and so much goodness, so much, I feel so much celebration by the numbers of us who are inquiring in these ways. Yeah.
Did you work with or talk with visual artists and poets and other collections of people interested in the arts who were here at the same time or just coming in at the same time? Photographers?
Yes.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Were they among your circle of your best friends or people you had to dinner or you shared babysitting duties with or whatever it was?
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
Well, actually, I was thinking to mention this before in terms of places and staying in Northampton, is that we used to move the office of Contact Quarterly, or where we did production, to different spaces because we didn't have an office. So sometimes we did it at the loft on Pleasant Street, or we would rent a room in Fitzwillies for 6 weeks and take the light table out from under the bed and set it up and card tables and make an issue and then fold it back up and put it under the bed. And then Paula, are you here? Hello. Clement Sager would come to the house on Elizabeth Street, which is where we kind of had an office for CQ. And I met Bill Arnold, who is a photographer, and we started using some of his photographs. And then we started renting space in his building in Florence. And then, you know, we'd move around to different spaces, close them up and open them up. And then that was where we had our first office. And I was just about to leave Northampton, I think. I thought, okay, well, you know, why am I here? And maybe I should go back to California or up to Vermont. And we got involved in a relationship, and also we got a full-time office, and he had photographs in CQ, and other photographers around here did too. So there was a lot of interaction, and also just being at Thorne's a lot of the time, there was an art gallery there. So you'd have to actually walk through it to get to the space, and you think, what's that, you know? And so I think it was just infused in the atmosphere because it was small enough. I think the proportions, are, again, really mattered. There wasn't like an art gallery over there and a dance studio over there. They were all mixed up, and so whether you liked it or not, you were exposed to stuff, and I think it had an effect.
And Robert Toby.
Yeah.
And also, our very first flyer was put together by Jim Sadler. And he was in Northampton, and now he's nearby town. And we're still working together almost 50 years later, across the internet.
Panagorsky, he was in the dancing, and he was taking pictures, and Eleanor Houston from Hampshire infused this group of dancers, Petronio, and people who ended up in Trisha's company in New York. And he made photographs, and then he made silk screens and posters for everybody. So there was a lot of intermixing.
And I'm also interested, I remember spending a very concentrated time early on in asking myself, is authentic movement an art or is it a discipline? And it was very hard for me to make that distinction.
What's the difference between art and discipline?
Well, yes. And I was so interested in that question and obviously chose the word discipline. I think, but there's still some sadness, even when you ask the question, there's some sadness because, at least in my own experience, and I imagine you both feel the same way, the discipline of authentic movement is profoundly a creative process because it's based on that which is unseen and unmanifested, not yet visible. So it's, and that's a longer discussion about what does creative mean in that context. Mm-hmm. The reason I chose discipline is because of the rigor, because of the amount of the requisite of concentration, of focus, and how that that object that is the focus of concentration through years of practice dissolves, and how that only seems to happen because of the kind of commitment and focus, eyes closed. There are just so many aspects that mirror mystical practices throughout the world that become familiar in this way. But there's no way for all those things that I named actually are central requisites for artistic work. Yeah, that's enough.
Well, we'll begin moving from what Nancy said. One of our questions is about after Northampton and how you decided to leave and what happened next, what you took from Northampton with you.
I live in Florence.
So let me just say that years ago I met a woman from
Took a
Texas.
lot with me, but not very far.
I met a woman from Texas who was shocked at just how parochial we are here, because she would say to someone, "Oh, you're from Northampton?" And they'd say, "No, I'm from Florence." And, she'd say, "I'm from Parish County." So yeah, we have a. So how did you move to Florence?
Well, we were here about 33 years, and I was teaching, the last program we did was 2000 in Smith.
6, did you say?
2006. We graduated 3 programs. And we were thinking, well, maybe we could do something else. So it was a lot of work, and lots of help, but it was a lot of work. So I started teaching in New York, a yoga program. I had been teaching it here and then went to New York. It was a modular program that went, I don't know how many modules over several years. We did that once or twice, I don't remember. You don't have to Google, just ask Len. That comes from this morning. And then I decided to go to California and run the program there, offer it. And so we were going out, I think 4 or 5 times a year, and it was expensive for housing. So we said, well, let's buy a little condo so we have a place to go. And meanwhile, I was starting to travel. I had been very ill in the period there, began traveling internationally again. And so our daughter, who's in the audience somewhere, I saw you there, was living in Florida and had left her job. And I said, well, what do you think about California? Would you like to? We're thinking of getting a little condo there for part of the year, back and forth. Come out and see if you like it. And you came out and you said yes, thinking we'd be coming in and out a few times a year. But then as soon as Basha said yes, in my mind, I sold our house because we hadn't been together in many, many years. And so, well, we'll get a little bigger condo. And then our son, who was living in Okinawa, married to a woman from Okinawa, and they had a little baby, said, well, if you move to California, we'll come to California. So then we got a bigger house, and then we had a son in Europe, and he said, I'm not coming, but we found a big house, and we cut one room into 2, and he came. And so that's why we left, because it brought our family together. And because we had stopped sorry, I have this hat. You don't know, but if you ever have cataract surgery, then you can't have a lot of bright light in your eye because you can see, but not with the bright light. But you can see, which is fantastic. And there's a real draw here, and we were just talking about how could we come back for a month or 2 months or 3 months? How could we come back here so we could actually hang out together, not just, like this for several days? That's just a question. Anyone have a house they don't need for 3 or 4 months a year? And that was 10 years ago.
I think once people move away, I have to say, from winter, it's really hard to move back. Because the ice thing and all of that is just, you get used to it and you just do it, and that's why there's the Yankee spirit, and we all, But once you liberate yourself from that, I think it's a little hard to come back.
Well, what we have in
Permanently.
competition are earthquakes, mudslides, drought, fire. I mean, I don't know about snow, but it's
That's
not
why
such
that's
a,
true, it's absolutely.
it's not such a challenge as it would seem.
No, it's true. Why did you leave? Are you,
Yeah, I finished.
We left because it seemed time to have more empty space around us. And New England was feeling exactly right for when we were here, in a way, feeling held by it. But it became time to, it was an imperative for me to have more space and go to the water, to the ocean. And I think I also had learned here that this discipline was 100% real for me, only because of each person who stepped into the emptiness. So it felt clear to me that each person with whom I had worked here was, well, my longing was that each one of you who are here now would take whatever you had received and let you needed and let the rest go, and develop your own relationship to the inner witness and how that phenomena appeared for you and how you then offered it into your world, your family, your work, your garden, all those ways. So I felt that it was okay, because that was so clear. It was not at all about me. It was totally about each one and the inner intimacy and emptiness that was being discovered. And also, by then, the inner witness was a clear force that I trusted that would accompany each of you and me, and however we all wandered around the rest of our lives. I've also felt very welcomed in California. And my husband, Philip, made these beautiful spaces for our work, his painting work and my the work with the discipline. So it all felt about space. Mm-hmm. And also the sand dunes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That light, Dillon Beach. Mm. The light in California. Yeah.
I was going to follow that with a question about how the seed sown locally went globally. Because so many
people
of you
travel.
Yeah, people travel. Well, you're invited. People travel. You know people from around the world.
Contact improvisation, in particular, as a form, needs two people to do it. And I think that is the single most reason, accompanied with the reason that it was not restricted to share it. It wasn't like you had to become certified or something like that to become a teacher. So if you liked it and you wanted to keep doing it, and you traveled or you lived somewhere else other than where you encountered it, you were kind of forced to share it. And it grew. And that's how it traveled to Europe. I mean, you could see in the back of the magazine we had this thing called the contacts list, we still do, so that you could find other people when you were traveling to do this thing with. And Christy Svein, a friend and colleague, talked about it as like finding a poker game or something, like when you come to town, like, where's the game? And so to find somebody who does this, so we made a list in the back of people that you could contact in different cities or places to find a jam or just to dance with. And you could see, if you did a fast forward of all the contacts lists over 30 years, when it, like California got big, or when, one person in Europe and then that got big, and then Canada, and, so it spread pretty organically in that way. Mm-hmm. And you need two people to do authentic movement too. You think that?
do. Well, this whole phenomena of two becoming one, becoming two, becoming one, relationship is the center of the discipline. The relationship between the inner witness and the moving body, one's own, and then between the mover and the witness, and then between the witness and all the other witnesses, and then between the self and one's God. I mean, it's all relationship. And how, whether we're merged in that relationship or in a dialogic relationship to each those forces, or in a place of unity consciousness where the duality dissolves. So it's a very exciting word.
Relationship?
Yeah. Really exciting. And it seems to be absolutely essential to be a person, yeah.
So do you think that actually was a propelling force in people sharing authentic movement with others, rather than becoming a more insular community?
Oh, yes. Because, well, actually it's very similar. You can't have a witness without a mover. Yeah, and a mover needs a witness. So there it is. And that's the ground form. That's, yeah. I love the ground form. Yeah. I am because we are. I am because you are. I remember receiving that, those words. Yes.
That's my first sound. As I said earlier, the last program that I directed was in 2006. And so other people have taken on our programs through our license trainings. And they are now in 16 countries, and 3 more are applying. And the next one that applied is for Taiwan. It would be the first in Asia. But there are 3 in South America and Canada and here, and almost all of the European that we travel to more, including Slovakia, Estonia, Germany, France, England, Spain, Greece. Anyway, there are 16, Poland, Ireland. And I'm not needed. It's quite wonderful. It has a life of its own. When you were saying that about being needed, I'm still wanting to be here, and I still have something to offer, but the work has its own life. And it's developing so that it's been a cellular model. We didn't know how to do any of it. So the first time we had 100 students in '86, I said, I don't know what to do with 100 people, so I'm not going to do anything. And that was the right answer. The 100 people, and some of you are here, we did it all together rather than somebody knowing what to do. No, we didn't know what to do. But if our cells in our body can know what to do, why can't we as a people know what to do by just allowing it to happen and not hurting each other? That's probably the only thing, was to deep listen and to deep listen. Yeah.
Bonnie, I love when you say that. I feel one of the places of the deep connection between us, in the sense that that's the only guideline in the discipline of authentic movement, the only one, and it starts at the beginning, and it's always, you close your eyes, you choose or not choose to what arises, and the only thing that is not allowed is hurting yourself or another. It's the only thing. It's the same thing you're talking about. The listening then occurs safely. And I imagine it's exactly the same in contact quarterly.
And it occurs to me that what you and we are describing, the value of that is what makes it spread. It's not about promoting yourself or trying to get things to people to want it. It's just such a profound experience, all these things, that you want to keep doing it. And you want to share it with people. And that's how it grows. So it has had a different growth pattern, you could say, for each of us. But I think that the impetus for that to happen, and the fact that people are traveling globally, travels the seeds. We're talking about seeds, and they go wherever people go. It's a person-to-person network. It's not like a marketing ploy where you learn about this. I don't know that anybody has come to any of these works for marketing.
Yeah.
I never thought about that before, actually. I mean, it's possible, but I just feel like there's something in the actual experience that wants to be communicated. And either it hits or misses. It's not resonant for everybody, and that's fine. There's no reason to force that. But it's resonant enough. And I also think that whether it's the do no harm or not preventing people from sharing it, those two things go together to make all of this grow, which is a really nice phenomenon.
And I think if I am safe, then I can much more likely trust what's arising within myself and within the other. But safety just feels like essential. When we think of children in school, if they don't feel safe, how can they possibly learn anything or trust their own inner experience of what they're receiving? It feels very ground and strong.
And maybe that brings us back to Northampton in a way, because we've just spread out over the world, but I think we all felt safe here. And the work felt safe here and fertile, and really no negative force that would stop it from growing. So it really got cultivated here and got strong enough to be shared and travel and all of that. I mean, there were other places, certainly in terms of contact improvisation, that was the case too. You know, in the Bay Area or even in New York, there were a lot of places in the world where this, and it's not centered on me. It's as opposed to, for a long time, body-mind centering and authentic movement, I think, were centered around these teachers, but has spread, and other people have become teachers, and it goes like that. But this work, contact wasn't, but each person was also at the same time very important, including me, in how and where it spread.
Actually, I want to add here the Body-Mind Centering Association started here 35 or 6 years ago. Maybe I think less than 10 people who graduated talked about starting some kind of a group. And the first thing was that Len and I aren't part of it, in the sense that it needed to be, we felt, separate, so that we had the school, and then the graduates developed the professional association, so there could be a dialogue and not any kind of oversight. And eventually, and I think was it last year that the BMCA conference was here? At Smith. I think it was the 35th, I'm not sure, year. And there's also a journal. And is Kate here? Yes. Do you want to say anything, Kate? Loudly?
Well, Current's journal started as a newsletter and became a journal with essays and energy very much inspired by CQ. I became the editor in 2004. There were 2 other editors before me, but we're exactly the half-life of CQ, and we are different and the same, and we weave. And Nancy and I have had a lot of, what do you mean by that?
Right. Actually, this is another growth thing, that in CQ we used to have articles about authentic movement, about BMC, and then we thought the works were growing, and it's like, we can't contain this. We can't be the vehicle for moving all these ideas that are growing so much, because we have limitations. It was still just hardly any people working for the organization, and so Moving Journal started. There was an authentic movement journal that started to have an integrity of its own, and it was like a relief to me that that community could have more space to develop their ideas and share their ideas with each other, and also Currents for BMC. So that's another, but we continue to weave back through one another. It's not like that far away, but it's another planting.
I like that word, planting, and I think if we could end here, because you have come sort of full circle from the initial, idea of Nest to feeling safe here and feeling it to be a place where things were planted and then could grow. I think you've said
that's
that.
very
Yeah,
good.
that's very, you're the very good ones.
By the way, tomorrow afternoon in the reception, or actually from 1 to 6 at Holly Street, CQ is going to open its store. So books and DVDs and magazines and all of that stuff a lot will be available for you to look at or buy if you want tomorrow afternoon. Or on the internet, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all 3 of you so much.
Yeah.